All right, we're going to talk about some of the history of VR and also kind of some of the key players in VR. There's this kind of article here. Some of these people are from this, some of them are not, or some of the things I talk about are not from this. But this is a very good article written by Polygon about 8 years ago, 9 years ago, about VR and people involved in it. So let's go through kind of the history of VR. So, if you want to talk about computers and computer technology, you really can't talk about it fairly without talking about the Cold War. Okay. And the reason why I bring up the Cold War, and a lot of times people don't talk about this when they talk about the history of technology, which is the idea that, if you don't know what the Cold War is, essentially after World War II, due to the devastation of the war, there were really only two superpowers globally, the USA and the USSR, which is the United Soviet Satellite Republics, also, which is basically modern day Russia and some of the surrounding smaller countries like Lithuania and stuff like that. Okay. So there's two superpowers. Okay. And they both have opposing ideologies when it comes to economics. Okay. USSR was a communist country, USA was a capitalist country. Although we never went to war with the USSR, there was a lot of like stockpiling. Basically, there was a fear from both sides that the other side was going to attack the other. And this led, the reason why that's important is that fear of, during the Cold War of the US government towards the USSR and its effects on the world is what caused the US government to fund a lot of money for research of computers and for technology. Okay. It also heavily funded NASA, which also comes into play for technology and VR specifically. Okay. So I argue, and it's a hill I'll die on, that if the Cold War never existed, I don't think computers would be where they are right now. I'm not saying we wouldn't have computers, we would, but I don't think the level of technology or speed that we currently have would have occurred because the early days of computers really needed a lot of funding, and there really wasn't a commercial reason for that. And there wasn't, I'm sure some private people would have funded it maybe a little bit, but the majority of the US government funding it has really pushed technology for computers and computer-based technology to where it is now. Okay. All right. So there's this guy. His name is Mort Hellig. This is 1957. This is a non-computer virtual reality, by the way. He creates this kind of, the best way to kind of describe it is it's kind of like an arcade game, if you will. You guys have probably been to arcade at some point in your life. Those kind of machines where it's kind of surrounds you. So he created this device called the Sensorama. And basically what it was you would sort of stick your head in and it would play a video. There were a couple experiences you could have. One was like a dune buggy and one was like hang gliding. So there's the visual aspect, but also it would play audio in your ear. It would actually, put wind, it'd blow wind on you. So there's like a physical sensation. So he would kind of use all these things to kind of create this kind of device. So this is what it looked like. It was a huge kind of, arcade style machine. He eventually created a smaller version called the Telesphere Mass, which was basically kind of the same thing. Kind of hope we give you kind of an idea of it. All right. So you can watch the whole video, but you can kind of see how it was definitely sort of meant to be sort of like a fun, very Disneyland-esque kind of thing. It was meant to be like, oh, look, it's fun. We're hang gliding, and there'll be smells. You can smell the ocean and that kind of thing. It never really got anywhere. It kind of sat in his garage, from my understanding. But it was he's kind of credited as kind of the first kind of idea of an immersive experiences for all of your senses. Moving forward, there's this guy named Ivan Sutherland. He had a large, he's a computer science guy, very influential in the impact of computer graphics as a whole. And he created what's referred to as the first head-mounted display, which is basically this. He created something called the Ultimate Display. You can kind of see photos of it here, where it has like these, things in front of his eyes. He, um, he, so he's known for kind of creating that stereoscopic viewpoint. Remember, I talked about like the two versions of an object, each to each eye, to kind of create that effect. He kind of has pioneered that. He also created sort of a head tracking mount system, which means tracking where your head is currently pointed. He had a very rudimentary version of that, which is what this is. It was kind of jokingly referred to as the sword of Damocles because it was very large and possibly dangerous if it fell on you. But he is kind of cited as creating the first kind of VR headset, so to speak, or a head-mounted display. Some other people around the world. This is Susumi Taichi, 1980. He was a engineer who was the director of biorobotics in Japan. In the late 70s, he comes over to America to be a sort of a guest teacher, instructor at MIT. And he basically comes up with this idea called teleexistence. It's the idea of giving a person a realistic sense of being in another place without having to go to it, which is kind of what VR is, right? These sort of virtual experiences. Um, his idea to do this was with remote hardware and robot interfaces. So he was kind of working more with like controlling external robots for so in other words, like I could look through my display and maybe control like a robot on the moon or underwater or something like that. That was kind of his idea at the time. This is 1980. There's this guy named Thomas Zimmerman. He there's a, during the 70s and early 80s, there was one of the first video game companies was called Atari. Okay, they created a console called the Atari System 2600, and then they also had a research lab where a lot of these kind of computer science and people kind of interested this kind of did research and come up with like sort of new cool ideas. In 1982, he comes up with this idea called he patents this, it's called a flex sensor. And so basically what it can do is detect when your fingers kind of contract like this. His idea initially was to create sort of a virtual kind of like playing virtual instruments like a guitar, using this kind of interface. You can see it here. He basically comes up with what's called a data glove, which is kind of like tracking your joints and other kinds of pieces of information to kind of give that to the computer as an input, computer input. Atari eventually kind of dies, mostly because of Nintendo's popularity in the mid 80s. He goes on to found another company called VLP with another computer science VR guy named Jaron Lanier. And they kind of focus on creating virtual reality tools, one of which is the Data Glove, which is, I mentioned this earlier, it's a glove that kind of gives, it's kind of more of a natural gesture input of like, turning your hand, gripping, that kind of stuff. He eventually kind of builds equipment that's used a lot by NASA. NASA is very much interested in the idea of virtual reality because they're trying to train their astronauts to, work on spaceships without actually going to space, or what it might be like to actually be on the moon, since they're eventually going to go. And so they were, NASA was a big proponent of this kind of technology. So this was this idea of a data glove. You can see it on an old Apple IIe. So it's like taking that data and kind of pushing it. Like I said, NASA was very big into the idea of virtual reality and sort of input like the data glove. Nintendo actually used some of this technology later for something called the Power Glove, which I actually had a Power Glove. It was not very good at playing Nintendo games, but it was kind of interesting looking. Basically, it was like you would wear it and you were supposed to do this when you play video games and things like that. Speaking of NASA, there was another guy named Scott Fisher who worked at MIT who would create a kind of a virtual mounted display for NASA called the Virtual Interface Environment Workstation, or VIEW. This was meant to sort of the idea of this was for astronauts to control robots on on like a space station to kind of do things that humans can't do. So you might control a robot to weld or something, or to, so this, they had this idea of kind of telepresence where it's like you're you, but you're controlling this other object in space, literal space, but I mean like 3D space is what I was referring to there. Jaron Lanier, he is a computer scientist, another former developer for Atari. He's mentioned Thomas Zimmerman. He kind of worked with Thomas Zimmerman to create VLP. And he was kind of big also on the idea of natural input and output for VR. So he creates like the data glove. He also creates a data suit, which the idea was like if you move your body, it can calculate your movements. And kind of worked on head mounted displays. He also called something called the iPhone, not that iPhone, but the iPhone, which was basically a head mounted display that went in front of your eye. This is kind of considered like the precursor to modern sort of head mounted displays. He's also kind of he's kind of given he kind of coined the term virtual reality. He was also very much influenced by this psychologist named Timothy Leary, who was very much into mind expanding abstraction, psychedelics, like literally psychedelics, like the drugs and the influence on that. He also did a lot of early sort of research into the concept of an avatar, or sort of a character that you embody in these VR worlds. All right, so the one thing you could kind of say about a lot of these early people, besides the fact that they're all computer scientists, is they kind of were doing it for either research or, application purposes for government, or, NASA or something like that. We start seeing kind of more modern here in like the 90s. We start seeing people kind of using VR more as a artistic expression, as opposed to purely like, some sort of functional output. So there's this woman named Brenda Laurel, who's that article I was talking about earlier. She was a developer, programmer, designer. She used to work at Atari, and she was very much into the concept of sort of narrative in virtual reality, not just like, oh, okay, I'm on a space station and, here's where all the panels are, but more like telling stories, having emotions through it. She created sort of this piece called Placeholder, which was an art installation where two people would sort of interact using their hands. This is what it looked like. I think I had a video of that. Maybe, maybe not. No. Sorry, didn't have that, but oh well. Oops. Another person named Charles Davies. She is another artist. She was interested in computer graphics and later joined the 3D animation company Softimage as the vice president of virtual reality research. And once again, kind of like with Brenda Laurel, she was kind of pushing boundaries of, what to do with virtual reality, not just using it as kind of a kind of a functional, like, oh, okay, we're going to use it to simulate, flying a plane, but using it for artistic purposes. She created two pieces, one called Osmos and the other called, I don't know if I can pronounce this correctly, Emfmere. One was about controlling a landscape using breath, and the other was about interactive gaze of the internal body. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but you can kind of see some examples of it here.
5 words you pronounce wrong.
Not the best quality, I'm going to warn you, but so it's kind of like you're in this world and it's controlled by your breath. Notice also it's very abstract as opposed to some of those others, which were much more like um, meant to be real situations like space station or, submarine. Okay, that's that one. Our other one, there's a here. Oh, was that? Did I show that one? No, this is one. Okay. Going back to kind of the technology kind of hitting, the sort of consumer culture, the mass culture outside of like, a lot of these were like MIT and other schools with strong computer science, but now it's like kind of getting into sort of the mainstream. Nintendo releases the Virtual Boy, which was like VR. It wasn't, in 1995. It had a thing of like it was only monochromatic and red. Here's some examples where everything was red and black. It was essentially red images on a black background. It's not true VR because it didn't do motion sensor. Like it was immersive in that you would put it right up to your face like this. You can see it had a tripod. So the idea was it would sit on a desk and you would sort of do this, and then you can see the controller there, and you'd be like this. But it didn't allow you to move your head at all. So it really wasn't sort of true VR. It cost at the time, this is 1995, about $180, which if you adjust it for inflation would be about $380 now. It did not do well. It pretty much failed after a year. Part of it is people didn't want this kind of red, you know, hue, so to speak, tint. The other is people complained about headaches from being immersed in it too long. So, that kind of put a little damper on, people putting money towards technology of VR a little bit because this failed. Another thing that kind of affected VR was, well, there was this dot-com bust. Okay, this actually happened in San Francisco, mostly among other places, but mostly here. The dot-com bust had more to do with the internet, but it affected VR because what happened was, due to a lot of companies starting in the mid 90s that were internet based and having really bad financial plans, a lot of those companies failed. Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is a lot of people invested in those companies and then they lost all their money. So, the reason why that's important to VR is, well, because, people lost all their money on internet stock for pets.com or whatever it was, they weren't really looking to invest in more tech. You know what I mean? Sort of burn me once, shame on you, burn me twice, shame on me. So it's kind of like, that kind of definitely hindered people's desire to invest money in VR. Also, at this point, this is 2000-ish. Remember that a big reason why we were putting money towards this was because of the Cold War. Well, the Cold War ended officially in 1990 or 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union. I know nowadays we still have our issues with Russia, but at this point, we were on generally friendly terms with Russia. So like there wasn't really that, fear of the other, so to speak. So the government wasn't really funding as much for technology or, virtual reality or anything like that. Here's some sort of modern, sort of more modern people using VR in the last 20 years. There's this woman named Nani de la Pena. She's a journalist, documentary, filmmaker, artist. Um, she's credited with kind of creating this idea called immersive journalism. And what she did is she combined using this technology, Unity, which we're actually going to use, to combine real witness audio for events that basically happened. So the idea was, that you could experience the actual event sort of by like, listening to the actual audio, being in the environment, seeing it from an actual perspective as opposed to just reading about it in a newspaper or, seeing an art, watching a news clip on television or something like that. Um, she's given the title of Godmother of Virtual Reality. So she did a piece called Gone Gitmo, which was an immersive experience about those people being prisoners of Guantanamo Bay. She also did another piece called Hunger in Los Angeles, which was about a homeless person fainting at a food bank. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can kind of watch it. So you can see how, this is the food bank, I believe. And then someone faints. And so we're looking around it in 3D space. And they're using the real audio from the event and such. And finally, another person kind of using this from a more artistic or an alternative kind of way is Mexican filmmaker Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu. Apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. In 2017, he created, I'm probably not going to say this correctly, Carne Irina or Carne Irina, a virtual reality narrative experience about migrants, refugees crossing over into the US. So this was an art piece. It was three pieces. Some were like done in person. Like the idea was, I believe, you started in a detention center, like an actual room that was meant to mimic a detention center. Then you would sort of put on the virtual reality goggles or headset, and then sort of the experience was like walking through the Chichen Desert with a coyote crossing the U.S. border. And then the third part was sort of a video, I believe, or like a projection on a wall that sort of had the experiences of migrants coming from El Salvador and Honduras and other places. So, this was kind of an art piece that incorporated virtual reality of, what it's like to actually be someone, a migrant crossing over the border and the things that they would face and things like that. So, once again, we're going from kind of maybe a little more literal to, like okay, we need to train our astronauts how to work on a space station to, okay, now we're kind of getting into artistic viewpoints, using it to, to understand everyday people, what it's like, put ourselves emotionally into that kind of area. I don't know if they show any footage. I think it's here. Is it? Maybe not. So I think they actually had sand, so it's like meant to make it more kind of realistic in terms of the experience or more true to life. All right. In the next videos, so that's kind of, what is virtual reality, kind of the history of virtual reality. Next, we're going to talk about, we're actually going to build a VR world. Okay. We'll talk about, for now, we're just going to use a browser-based software called framevr.io. We're going to talk about how to build a virtual world, world building, so to speak, that eventually you guys are going to be able to experience with your Oculus Quests. Okay.